Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on us.
Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on us.
On this feast of All Saints' Day, I want to explore with all of you what it means to be a saint. Growing up in the Roman Catholic Church, I learned to venerate saints. Saints were above the human ranks. Indeed, saints, after all, have had at least 2 miracles even to be eligible to be considered a saint. In the Episcopal Church, we have a much more democratic view of sanctity as being more about living an exemplary life. Some of those who have lived an exemplary life have had their lives recorded in books such as Lesser Feasts and Fasts or Holy Women, Holy Men. Yet even these 2 books failed to capture the full richness of the saintly men and women who live among us. I prefer not so much to talk about the unreachable or untouchable saintliness, but the everyday saints who live in our families, our households, and here at church in the pew next to us. Oh no, you might say, I'm not a saint, I'm not worthy. So stay tuned for the next few minutes. After 10 years in the Episcopal Church, in the Anglican tradition, I have found 5 characteristics as reliable pointers to the saints who are among us. I'll say these principles and pointers at the beginning of my sermon and then at the end of my sermon. Saints are people who are available to follow God, not out of pattern, but when their lives are interrupted and disrupted by God's grace. Saints are people who are close to God when God comes close to them versus are seeking God. Saints are people who struggle to see and experience God in new ways, through new lenses. These are people who are willing to adapt to grace received rather than graces expected or patterned on the history of our norms. Saints are people whose knowledge of God increases as they decrease, as we decrease in our self-vision and self-worth, to adopt a communal vision in the Spirit and rooted in God. Saints are people that rejoice that they find themselves in the palm of God's hands and unreservedly place their trust in God and in the loving and caring community that surrounds them. I'm finding different models for sanctity that match these characteristics. One model that may surprise you, having just come back from diocesan convention, is our mission statement for the Diocese of Northern California. You know it, but let me remind you. Making disciples, raising up saints, transforming communities for Christ. And today, what I want to talk about is the raising up of saints, according to the characteristics that I've just shared with you, and the transforming of communities, mostly the transforming of St. Francis. A major part of who we are as a church in this diocese and the whole Episcopal Church is our effort to raise up saints and transform our congregations. And central to my sermon and to the understanding of sainthood in this way, a very different way than the Roman Catholic way, is that we all have the capacity to be saints. And we are all expected to be saints. Sanctity is not reserved for the few, but for all. Here at St. Francis, our lives have been over and over interrupted by God's grace. The life of this congregation is planned and unplanned interruptions and disruptions are not over. If you read your recent Voices, you know I have a planned interruption or two for the season of Advent. In the planned and unplanned interruptions, we have the opportunity to sharpen our awareness and pay attention to the various ways that Christ comes into our lives. Today, the vestry will consider the self-nomination of 3 members who are discerning with all of us if they are called to serve on vestry in the coming year at St. Francis. In the past, you would not have heard your priest talk about discernment of vestry in November. So there is a shift here. Only one of the 3 members who will come before the vestry in their statements and essays has previously served on vestry, but all have significant and visible leadership in this parish. But these 3 members are open to the Spirit working in this congregation in ways that may call them in January at our annual meeting to leadership in ways that they've never sought or expected. I'd like to see these member self-nominations as graceful interruptions of the pattern of the history of this congregation, where we became comfortable with a few taking responsibility. In healthy congregations, all the people strive to be saints, working together to transform communities in Christ's name. The saints are not those just who come forward, but those who stand back to let others accept leadership. At Diocesan Convention, I shared with a few people, those who would listen to me, my principles for voting for Board of Trustees, Standing Committee, and deputies to General Convention. And I have had some progress with a few tables. I look for people who have never held diocesan leadership roles before, as I like to see leadership rotate among the many and not stagnate in the few. For the church to be strong, we need to be able to say that we are not dependent on the few, but the many of us will gather together. It is so easy for us, for me too, as I will share with you briefly, to become dependent on the few and fear that if these are not present, that we will fail. Our life of faith is at odds with this practice. A stagnant selection practice in our church or in our diocese suggests that the gifts and blessings are among the few rather than the many. But we believe that it is the grace and peace of God that keeps us going, not any one of us, not least me. It is when we work as a collective that we are strong. In addition to the ways our lives in the Episcopal Church and in this congregation intersect with sanctity, over the last 6 months, I've been learning about sanctity in the chemo infusion room at California Pacific Medical Center. It is paradoxical, but in church and in congregations and in dioceses, we can make a strident effort to avoid sanctity. However, in the chemo infusion room, sanctity is much more difficult to avoid or to impede. In the chemo infusion room, I'm meeting people whose lives have been interrupted and disrupted by their diagnosis of cancer. The people I'm meeting are people whose vision and plans for themselves have been put on their head, complete somersaults of their lives. And not everybody in the chemo room is as happy as our dearly beloved Stephanie, but every single last person is struggling to find life, to find grace, and to find blessing in this new place that they find themselves. The courage is in the chemo infusion rooms is just palpable. All week long, as I've been preparing this sermon and these words of reflection, I've had a story on my mind from the wonderful book, Kitchen Table Wisdom. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. I recall the story of a man who had cancer and was dying. And Naomi, the woman who wrote the books, will share this in a 2 to 3 page snippet far better than I will, but I think you'll capture the vision. I recall the story of this man who was dying of cancer, married with a spouse. He was terrified of what would happen when he died and his wife had to pay the bills and to take care of the administration of the household. I know this comes close to some of you. The man took so much care in their years of marriage that his spouse came to believe she was incapable of accepting the responsibility. She was terrified of living without him. And yet, when her spouse died, she was amazed at the responsibility that she was able to accept and to manage. She took on all the responsibility, mostly for her children, more than herself. But in actuality, she came to a new self-awareness of her capacity to lead her family. She was able to move through a period of self-doubt. Before Stephanie and I got married, I had lived on my own from 1993 to 2001. Of course, in earlier years, I had also lived by myself. But just before marriage, I had a total of 8 years living, working on my own. I worked, I shopped, I cooked, and I cleaned for myself. I was pretty self-sufficient. And if I did not do it, it did not get done. I did not eat. My house was a mess. You get the idea. In May, when Stephanie got sick, and we got home from Glasgow in June, things I had grown accustomed to her doing these last 13 years of marriage, suddenly I could do for myself. I remember how awestruck Stephanie was that I could do certain things. This has not gone away. This has become a household joke when she wants to get my goat. A lot of these things were very simple things. But at the time when I gave them over to Stephanie, they seemed impossible. Let me give you a couple of examples. Stephanie would always replace the dispenser soap in the bathroom from our reserve supply. I always gave the excuse that the large bottle of dispenser soap into the smaller bottle was just too hard for my trimmer, and it was impossible. I could not do it without spilling all the soap everywhere. So I never did it. Stephanie always did it. I said, "Did you see that the soap is missing?" "Oh yes, I will attend to that soon." Stephanie always turned on the dishwasher. Again, with my trimmer, I would be always afraid that I would skip it all the way to the end. So I would never turn on the dishwasher. This is the best one. Stephanie would do all the shopping, mostly because I hate stores. And some stores I just resisted going into on my own. One day, a couple of months ago, in her shock of seeing me do these things and others that I won't mention this morning, Stephanie said, "Did you just bamboozle me these last 13 years?" I was offended. "Of course not, honey. I just got comfortable following a pattern of inaction and your gracious willingness to step forward." Life in the parish is like this too. Over time, we come to expect the same people to do the same jobs, and we all come to believe that none of us are capable of doing them without these reliable contributions. When we cease to strive to live fully into shared efforts for our common life, we cease to strive for life and cease to live fully into the responsibilities that God expects of all of us. We need to live into the expectations that we all are called to be saints, not in the Roman Catholic way, but in the way that I shared with you this morning. I find in life, and I'm finding in my life with Stephanie, If the expectations are higher, I tend to give more. When the expectations are low, I just don't turn on the dishwasher. On this All Saints' Day, we are all saints in the making. I offer all of you and me a few questions that modify in the form of these 5 principles, 5 pointers to sainthood, questions that help us reflect. And I know Megan will post this sermon this week, and you can refer back to the questions. These are questions that I find very helpful for myself at this time in my life, both as your priest and as a spouse of a person who has cancer. As I say these questions to you, I hope you will not feel compelled to say yes to all the questions, but rather to take solace that we are on a lifelong journey of becoming that which God calls us to be. And so I say, are we available to follow God when God's grace interrupts our cherished patterns? Do we struggle to see and experience God in new ways and through new lenses? Are we willing to adapt to grace received rather than graces we expect or have been accustomed to receiving? Do we have an experience of our knowledge of God increasing as we decrease in our self-absorption? Do we rejoice when we find ourselves in the palm of God's caring hands and unreservedly place our trust in God? If you're like me, it is unlikely that you answered all these questions with an unreserved yes. Yet I have no doubt that you and I are on the path to becoming saints in the Anglican tradition, who dwell in God's light as we strive to be more open and available to God's grace, love, and mercy, showing up in our lives in unexpected ways. God bless you.